Rome built an empire that lasted for centuries, conquering lands from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to the borders of Persia. Its legions were unstoppable, its engineering unmatched, its influence eternal. But at the heart of this mighty civilization sat men whose cruelty shocked the ancient world and still horrifies us today. Picture the Colosseum filled with 50,000 screaming spectators. In the imperial box sits a young man, barely in his 20s, giggling with delight as gladiators tear each other apart below. This isn't entertainment to him. It's foreplay to the real violence he has planned for later. His name is Commodus, and he's just one of the monsters who wore the purple of Roman emperors. How did the greatest civilization in human history produce some of history's most depraved rulers? How did men given ultimate power over millions of lives use that power to satisfy their darkest impulses? And what does their reign of terror teach us about the corrupting nature of absolute authority? Today we'll journey through the reigns of Rome's most ruthless emperors, men who turned the imperial palace into a house of horrors, who murdered family members for sport, who declared themselves gods while their people suffered. These are the stories of power unchecked, madness unleashed, and empires ruled by fear. To understand Rome's darkest rulers, we must first understand the system that created them. The Roman Empire, by the 1st century CE, was a machine that concentrated unimaginable power in the hands of a single man. No checks, no balances, no accountability. Just absolute authority over 60 million people. In 37 CE, a 24-year-old man inherited this terrifying power. His real name was Gaius, but the soldiers called him Caligula, Little Boots, because as a child, he had worn miniature military gear around the army camps. Rome celebrated his ascension. Finally, they thought, a young, energetic leader to replace the reclusive and paranoid Tiberius. They had no idea what they had unleashed. For the first 7 months, Caligula seemed like the emperor Rome had been waiting for. He freed political prisoners, recalled exiles, and gave generous bonuses to the army and people. But then something changed. Perhaps a severe illness, perhaps the intoxication of absolute power, or perhaps the revelation of his true nature. What followed was 4 years of systematic terror. Caligula declared himself a living god, forcing senators to worship him. He built a temporary floating bridge across the Bay of Naples, nearly 3 miles long, just so he could ride across it wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate, mocking a prophecy that said he had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the Gulf of Baiae. But his megalomania was nothing compared to his cruelty. He forced his own sisters into incestuous relationships, then exiled them when he grew bored. When his favorite sister Drusilla died, he declared her a goddess and made it a capital offense to laugh, bathe, or dine with family while the empire was in mourning. Caligula took special pleasure in humiliating the Senate. He made his horse Incitatus a consul, giving an animal more power than Rome's most distinguished citizens. He forced senators to run alongside his chariot for miles in their togas. When one senator's son was executed, Caligula invited the father to dinner the same day, forcing him to appear cheerful and eat heartily, while his child's body was still warm. The nightmare ended in 41 CE when his own Praetorian Guard, led by Cassius Chaerea, assassinated him in a palace corridor. His reign lasted less than 4 years, but in that time he had murdered thousands, bankrupted the treasury through his extravagances, and shown the world what happened when unlimited power met unlimited cruelty. But Rome's descent into darkness was just beginning. 17 years after Caligula's assassination, another young man took the throne. Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus was just 16 years old when he became emperor in 54 CE. Unlike Caligula, he was not born to power. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, had maneuvered, seduced, and quite possibly murdered her way to place her son on the throne. Nero's early reign was guided by capable advisors, the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus. For 5 years, known as the Quinquennium Neronis, Rome experienced relative prosperity and good governance. But beneath the surface, a monster was growing. By 59 CE, Nero had grown tired of his mother's influence and control. What happened next shocked even the Romans, who were no strangers to political violence. Nero decided to murder his own mother, the woman who had made him emperor, First, he tried to engineer a boating accident, designing a collapsible boat to drown her. When Agrippina survived by swimming to shore, Nero abandoned subtlety. He sent soldiers to her villa, where they clubbed and stabbed her to death. When the centurion raised his sword, Agrippina reportedly pointed to her womb and said, "Strike here." This bore Nero. In July 64 CE, a massive fire consumed Rome for 6 days, destroying 10 of the city's 14 districts. While the popular myth claims Nero fiddled while Rome burned, fiddles didn't exist yet, it would have been a liar. The truth is more complex. Nero actually organized relief efforts and opened his own palaces to refugees. But then came the construction of his Golden House, an enormous palace complex covering 300 acres in the heart of Rome, built partially on land cleared by the fire. Romans began to whisper that Nero had started the fire himself to clear space for his architectural fantasies. Needing a scapegoat, Nero blamed the Christians, a small unpopular sect. What followed was the first systematic persecution of Christians in Roman history. They were crucified, fed to wild animals, and burned alive as human torches to light Nero's garden parties. The historian Tacitus wrote that even Romans who had no love for Christians were disgusted by the cruelty. Nero fancied himself an artist and performer. He competed in chariot races, sang at public venues, and forced the Senate to attend his performances. When he performed, no one was allowed to leave, not even for medical emergencies. Pregnant women reportedly gave birth during his lengthy recitals rather than risk the death penalty for leaving. He was so deluded about his artistic talents that he toured Greece, competing in every major festival. He won over 1,800 crowns, not through talent, but because judges feared for their lives if they didn't award him first prize. By 68 CE, Nero's excesses had bankrupted the empire and triggered widespread rebellion. The Senate declared him a public enemy. As his world collapsed, Nero reportedly said, "What an artist perishes in me," before forcing a freedman to help him commit suicide. But Rome's appetite for tyrannical rulers was far from satisfied. After Nero's suicide, Rome eventually stabilized under the Flavian dynasty and then entered its golden age under the 5 good emperors. The last of these was Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor whose meditations still inspire people today. Surely his son would continue this enlightened rule. The son was Commodus, and he would prove that evil doesn't skip generations. It waits for the perfect moment to resurface. Marcus Aurelius Commodus Antoninus became emperor in 180 CE, at age 18. Unlike his predecessors who had gained power through adoption and merit, Commodus was the first emperor in nearly a century to inherit the throne by birth. He had been raised in luxury, sheltered from responsibility, and groomed for absolute power without the wisdom to wield it. Commodus became obsessed with gladiatorial combat, not as a spectator but as a participant. He fought in the arena hundreds of times, always against wounded animals, inexperienced opponents, or gladiators fighting with wooden weapons while he used steel. The sight of the emperor of Rome fighting like a common slave horrified the aristocracy, but Commodus reveled in their disgust. He forced senators to attend these spectacles and charged the city treasury enormous sums for his appearances, reportedly 1,000 gold pieces per performance. When he killed 100 bears in a single day, he declared it proof of his divine favor. But Commodus's arena antics were just the public face of his cruelty. Behind palace walls, he orchestrated a reign of terror that made Nero look restrained. He executed senators on trumped-up charges, confiscating their wealth to fund his excesses. He sold government positions to the highest bidder, turning the Roman administration into his personal auction house. Like Caligula before him, Commodus declared himself divine, specifically the reincarnation of Hercules. He appeared in public wearing lion skins and carrying clubs, forcing Romans to worship him as a god. He renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana, City of Commodus, and ordered that all months of the year be renamed after his various titles. Commodus's spending was so excessive that he bankrupted the Roman treasury. He melted down silver statues to mint coins, debased the currency, and imposed crushing taxes. The empire that had enjoyed prosperity under Marcus Aurelius began to crumble under his son's mismanagement. By 192 CE, even Commodus's inner circle had had enough. His own court, led by his mistress Marcia, his chamberlain Eclectus, and the praetorian prefect Latus, conspired against him. When poison failed to work quickly enough, they sent a gladiator named Narcissus to strangle him in his bath. Rome's golden age had ended with 12 years of madness, but the empire's capacity for producing monster emperors was far from exhausted. Sometimes the most dangerous rulers are those who live in the shadows of greatness. Titus Flavius Domitianus, Domitian, was the younger brother of the beloved Emperor Titus, who had completed the Colosseum and responded heroically to the eruption of Vesuvius. When Titus died suddenly in 81 CE, Domitian inherited an empire that remembered his brother fondly and viewed him with suspicion. Domitian was intelligent, capable, and utterly paranoid. Unlike the flamboyant madness of Caligula or the artistic delusions of Nero, Domitian's evil was methodical and calculated. He transformed the Roman government into a surveillance state where informers lurked in every corner, and treason trials became weekly entertainment. Ironically, Domitian was one of Rome's more effective administrators. He balanced the budget, rebuilt the city after fires, and strengthened the empire's borders. But this competence made his cruelty even more chilling. He wasn't mad. He was simply evil. Domitian expanded the definition of treason to include almost any criticism of his rule. Possessing a map of the world was treasonous. It might be used to plan rebellion. Writing about the lives of philosophers was treasonous. It might inspire independent thinking. Even praising previous emperors too enthusiastically could be interpreted as criticism of the current regime. The historian Tacitus lived through Domitian's reign and later wrote, "We drank in servitude with our very breath. We lost the power of speech along with the habit of listening." The terror was so complete that Romans began to police their own thoughts. Domitian murdered his own cousin Flavius Clemens on charges of atheism, likely meaning he had converted to Christianity or Judaism. He exiled Clemens's wife, Flavia Domitilla, to a desolate island. Their crime: failing to show sufficient enthusiasm for emperor worship. So paranoid was Domitian about assassination that he had the walls of his palace corridors lined with polished marble that acted as mirrors, allowing him to see anyone approaching from behind. He conducted audiences standing, never sitting where his back might be to the door. Despite his precautions, Domitian's paranoia proved justified. In 96 CE, his own wife Domitia and several court officials conspired to assassinate him. According to Suetonius, Domitian had been warned by fortune-tellers that he would die at the 5th hour of a specific day. On that morning, he kept checking the time. When told it was the 6th hour, he relaxed, not knowing his servants had lied, and it was actually the 5th hour. Moments later, he was stabbed to death in his bedroom. The Senate was so relieved that they immediately ordered his name chiseled off all public monuments, a fate called damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. But Rome's cycle of tyranny was far from over. After a period of relative stability under the Antonine dynasty, Rome faced a new kind of horror in 201 CE. Emperor Septimius Severus died, leaving the empire jointly to his two sons, Caracalla and Geta. Their father's dying words were reportedly, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men." The brothers were anything but harmonious. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, known as Caracalla, was 22 when he became co-emperor with his younger brother. The arrangement lasted less than a year. In December 211 CE, Caracalla arranged a peace meeting with Geta in their mother's apartment. As Geta entered for the reconciliation embrace, Caracalla's soldiers emerged from hiding and murdered him in his mother's arms. Julia Domna, their mother, was forced to watch her younger son bleed to death while her older son showed no remorse. Caracalla then ordered the execution of anyone who mourned Geta, including most of his brother's supporters, estimated at 20,000 people. Paradoxically, Caracalla issued one of the most progressive laws in Roman history, the Constitutio Antoniniana of 212 CE, which granted Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire. This sounds enlightened until you understand his motivation. More citizens meant more people to tax, and Caracalla needed money to fund his military campaigns and lavish spending. Caracalla was obsessed with Alexander the Great and believed himself to be Alexander's reincarnation. He raised soldiers' pay by 50%, bankrupting the imperial treasury, and launched expensive campaigns to recreate Alexander's conquests. He even formed a Macedonian phalanx using Roman soldiers and insisted on being called Alexander by his court. His cruelty extended beyond politics into pure sadism. In Alexandria, he ordered a massacre that killed thousands of young men, supposedly because the Alexandrians had mocked him in theatrical performances. He invited all the young men of the city to a recruitment ceremony, then had his soldiers surround and slaughter them. He once ordered a man to be thrown to wild beasts for the crime of bearing the same name as his murdered brother. When told the man was innocent, Caracalla replied, "He has the name, let him have the fate as well." Caracalla's reign of terror ended abruptly in 217 CE. While campaigning in Mesopotamia, he stopped by the roadside to relieve himself. His praetorian prefect Macrinus, who feared he was next on Caracalla's execution list, had arranged for a soldier named Martialis to assassinate the emperor. Caracalla died in the dirt beside a Roman road, killed while in one of the most vulnerable human positions. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers. A man who had lived without dignity died without it as well. As we examine these reigns of terror, a pattern emerges. Each of these emperors began with promise or at least public acceptance. Each gradually revealed their true nature as absolute power corrupted absolutely, and each left Rome weaker, more divided, and more cynical about imperial rule. The Roman imperial system had a fundamental flaw. It concentrated ultimate power without meaningful restraints. While the Senate still existed, it had become a rubber stamp for imperial decisions. The Praetorian Guard, meant to protect the emperor, often became the emperor's greatest threat when their loyalty could be bought. These dark reigns had consequences beyond the immediate suffering they caused. Each tyrannical emperor damaged the moral authority of imperial rule, making future rebellions more likely. They bankrupted the treasury through their excesses, weakened the military through poor leadership, and created a culture of fear that stifled innovation and progress. Perhaps most tragically, the terror these emperors created led to the destruction of knowledge and culture. Writers self-censored, philosophers fled or were executed, and artistic expression became dangerous. We can only imagine what works of literature, philosophy, and science were lost because their creators feared imperial displeasure. Rome's darkest emperors serve as a mirror for all civilizations. They show us what happens when power is unlimited, when accountability disappears, and when the moral constraints of society break down. Their reigns remind us that civilization is fragile, that progress can be reversed, and that the veneer of culture can quickly peel away to reveal the beast beneath. But these emperors didn't operate in a vacuum. They were enabled by systems, supported by institutions, and obeyed by millions. The Praetorian Guard carried out their orders. The Senate legitimized their decrees. The people often cheered their spectacles. This complicity raises uncomfortable questions about how ordinary people become participants in extraordinary evil. We know about these horrors primarily because some brave Romans chose to record them despite the risks. Historians like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio preserved these stories, often writing years later when it was safer to tell the truth. Their courage in documenting these dark chapters ensures that we can learn from Rome's mistakes. The stories of Caligula, Nero, Commodus, Domitian, and Caracalla aren't just ancient history. They're warnings about human nature and political systems. They remind us that no society is immune to tyranny, that power must always be checked and balanced, and that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. Rome's darkest rulers teach us that absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it reveals. Perhaps Caligula, Nero, and the others weren't made evil by power. Perhaps power simply stripped away the social constraints that kept their evil hidden. In positions where they could indulge any impulse without consequence, their true natures emerged. Yet Rome survived these monsters. After each tyrant fell, the empire found ways to rebuild, reform, and continue. This resilience speaks to something profound about human civilization, our capacity to endure even the worst leadership and emerge stronger. The Romans developed new institutions, checks on power and cultural norms specifically to prevent future Neros and Caligulas. The legacy of Rome's darkest emperors isn't just the horror they caused, but the lesson they provide. They remind us that evil can wear a crown, that cruelty can speak with authority, and that civilization must always guard against those who would use power to satisfy their darkest impulses. As we close this journey through Rome's Chamber of Horrors, remember that these weren't mythical monsters. They were human beings given ultimate authority over other human beings. Their choices shaped the lives of millions and the course of history itself. The question these dark rulers leave us with isn't whether such evil can happen again. History has already answered that question repeatedly. The question is whether we, as citizens and guardians of our own civilizations, will recognize the warning signs and have the courage to act before absolute power creates absolute corruption. The ghosts of Rome's darkest emperors whisper to us across the centuries, power without restraint is evil without limit. It's a lesson written in blood across the pages of history, and one we ignore at our peril. Rome's empire lasted over 1,000 years after these tyrants died. Their evil was real, but it was not eternal. Perhaps that's the most important lesson of all.